Just a little bit more about myself. I've helped build and manage some of the largest Native heritage museums in the country, including the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. This is an image of First Americans Museum that we opened in 2021. And I didn't design, wasn't part of the design of this museum, but I did help kind of re-envision the interior of the space. The shell of the facility was already built when I got there, and I had an opportunity. It was designed all the way back in um, 2002, 2003, and these things didn't exist until 2007. So um, I had an opportunity to come in 2017 and kind of uh, re-envision what the space was like. I remember looking at the plans of this facility, and they still had payphones in the design of the facility, and we swapped those out for water bottle filling stations. So it was great to have the opportunity to come in and kind of modernize the interior of the facility. Um, Also, the associate director of the National Museum of the American Indian, I helped build this facility on the National Mall in Washington, and we opened in 2004 is when we opened that museum, and also helped develop the storage facility, the Cultural Resources Center out in Suitland, Maryland. And I was on the collections management team at that point in time. Helped develop one of the first culturally sensitive collections management plans in the country, working with Scott Carroll at the time. Now he ended up being Scott Carley, but we worked together and work with tribes all over the hemisphere on the management of sensitive collections. And um, and I helped finish and open the 2009 expansion of the Anchorage Museum, and had a chance to work there for 7 years. Um, so I've had a lot of experience with large museums, but I've also helped develop smaller museums. I helped my tribe develop and open our tribal museum. I've helped other tribes around the country, currently helping Chugach with the facility they're going to build in Anchorage. And I love working on the smaller projects for a lot of reasons. One, it's, when you work on a larger project, you've got multiple entities you're working with. In the case of Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, we were working with over 700 tribal nations. First Americans Museum was 39 tribal nations, but I love, places like Warm Springs and other places where you're just working with that particular community. You can get very specific on what you're doing um, in terms of the design and the strategy. And I just wanted to share a little experience that I had when I was at the National Museum of the American Indian at Smithsonian. I was in charge of the repatriation program, among other things, and we had the opportunity to return some totems to Saxman Village, um, just outside of Ketchikan. And um, we had several totems that were taken by the Harriman expedition around the turn of the 19th century. And some of these totems ended up at the Field Museum, Smith College, and a couple other places. And so we formed a if you hear that noise, it's very windy today, and there's a pecan tree that kind of canopies my house, and the pecans are falling on top of my roof. And so if you hear a bang, that's the pecans coming off the tree. But anyway, so we formed a little coalition to return these totems and other items to the Tlingit community there out in Ketchikan in Saxman Village. And we returned a 44-foot totem pole, and this is in New York City at the Bronx at our old storage facility, and we built an armature for that totem. And the problem was that most tractor trailer, we're going to ship it by land to Seattle and put it on a barge, but most tractor trailers are only 40 feet long, and this totem was 44 feet long. So I was working with Joe Williams, who was president of the community at the time, And I said, we can always take a chainsaw and cut the end of it off and we'll put it back together when we get there. But that was, not an option. So I didn't know what to do. So I ended up calling FedEx. I don't know if you can see the FedEx truck right there. And we actually FedExed the totem pole from New York City to Ketchikan, Alaska. And there was a ceremony that was happening within a few days. So they had drivers, they had a couple drivers that would take turns. They didn't stop, they just kept going all the way to Seattle. And we got it on a barge and got it back to Ketchikan. So, and I've worked um, quite a bit with different communities in Alaska over the years. What I really love about the State Museum is that shared stewardship arrangement that State Museum has with local communities there for the care and management of collections, and that's an option, hopefully, for a lot of different Native communities if they don't have their own facilities that they can work out arrangements for shared stewardship for collections that they can have access to in other facilities. I'm working on that right now with my own tribe in Kansas. Kaw is short for Kanza or Kanza. I'm an enrolled member of the Kaw Nation, and Kaw is short for Kanza or Kansas. So the state of Kansas is named after my tribe, and we have a lot of cultural material in the state of Kansas. And we acquire items all the time through repatriation and other ways, but we don't have really a proper facility to manage those collections. So we've been making arrangements with Kansas State Historical Society and University of Kansas to where we would own the items and they would manage them for us. So that's happening more and more. So that's I just wanted to throw that out there because I know it can be an option for some of the communities in Alaska to have arrangements with local facilities if there are local ones to have that shared stewardship option. Um, this is about planning a tribal museum or heritage center. And I wanted to go through a few things that people should consider when building a heritage center. And the most important thing is master planning, is to sit down and figure out um, these some of these categories here. And I'll go through each one of these, but you know, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should if you can't sustain it over time. And that's a big issue with a lot of tribes. They might get a big grant from somewhere, or I know some tribes had a bunch of ARPA money left over and they wanted to build a tribal museum or heritage center, but they didn't think about how they're going to sustain that facility once it's built. So I'll go through all of that so people can kind of understand that a little bit. So these are some of the categories that I'm going to run through, and then I'll show you some examples, real world examples that I've worked on. So first of all, I wanted to talk about purpose, and uh, the number one question is, why do we need a heritage center? Why should we build a heritage center? And there's lots of answers to that question, but a lot of times, and from my own perspective and being a tribal person myself, I see the management of cultural heritage as an act of sovereignty, as an act of tribal sovereignty that um, for so long, other institutions, other folks have had control of our cultural patrimony, control of our cultural heritage. And now, through different programs and grants and so forth, tribes are now asserting their right and their sovereignty to manage their own cultural heritage. And NAGPRA was a big instigator in all of this when that act was passed in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, Historic Preservation Act. A lot of other pieces of legislation have come along to help support that. And then through community development block grants and other ways to fund these centers, you see more and more popping up around the country. So for my opinion, I for tribes that have the capacity to do it, I think it's important for tribes to take control over their cultural heritage and their cultural patrimony, and to manage these things for themselves. And there could be other reasons too. Could be tourism, could be a reason. Um, also, with NAGPRA receiving a lot of collections back from other institutions, um, and not having places to put them, maybe there's an idea of just having a cultural repository, so that's an option as well. So I think people should understand why they're doing this. And again, is it economic? Is it because of the volume of material? But again, in my opinion, it's an act of tribal sovereignty, cultural sovereignty. Feasibility and sustainability. Um, do you have the resources to build the facility? And thinking about the size of the facility, um, it's expensive in Alaska in particular. It's a lot more expensive to build in Alaska. When we were working on the expansion of the Anchorage Museum, Anchorage is in a high earthquake zone, as most of Alaska is, and so the costs of building in Alaska are a lot higher. So yeah, thinking about the cost of building a facility is something to take into consideration, and that'll affect the size, the square footage of the facility. And then once it's built, what's the sustainability plan? Do you have funds to operate the facility? And what are the sources of those funds? And I'll talk about that in a second. Any questions so far on this? Okay, I'll go to the next one. Um, so audience, who are you building the facility for? I've worked with tribes that wanted to build cultural centers or heritage centers to educate the broader public about their community. Cherokee, the Cherokee People's Museum in North Carolina. We were just there for ATOM. A big part of their plan is to educate others about who they are as a people, as well as serve as a repository for their cultural materials. But their model is to, the majority of their visitors are going to be um, non-community members coming in and wanting to learn about the heritage and culture for that community. Other institutions are more internally focused. They're building cultural centers and heritage centers for their own community to educate their own people. In my tribe's case, we don't have a lot of visitors. We're, a wide spot in a very small highway. We're one of the blue highways, and there's not a lot of traffic coming by my tribe. So we've built a heritage center not only to be a repository, but to educate our community on the cultural lifeways, cultural heritage classes, language classes, those kinds of things to really focus on the community. And this can be a combination of both too, kind of internally focused and externally focused. And so there's a difference between constituents and customers. I think of the community as the constituents, and there's a mission for the local community in that. And then customers are people who are coming to visit the facility to learn about your culture, your community, your tribe, or um, your village. So there's both. There's a couple different audiences, and usually with constituents, there isn't a revenue stream coming from that group. You're actually developing programs and services for the constituents, where customers actually will contribute earned income. And many times, if you're charging admission, or you have a gift shop, or there's other forms of revenue, renting out the facility for events and so forth. So thinking about those audiences, but most heritage centers that I've worked with, the primary audience is going to be the people in their own community, and then customers are secondary. So thinking about that, who your audiences are going to be. Stakeholders, who are the supporters of your project? Is it going to be the native corporation, or the tribal community, or the tribal government? Is it going to be a municipality? Is it going to be, are there grants? Are there foundations that are going to help support um, the project, not only the construction, but the sustainability of that? So, you might get a grant, a community development block grant to build a facility, or at least to fund most of it. But then where's the rest of it going to come from? And then once it's open, what's your um, what's your funding to help sustain that operation? And we'll talk about that in a second. So governance. Um, in my community, the tribal council actually manages the museum. I don't think that's the best way to manage a facility, to have the government manage the facility, the tribal government manage the facility, or a village corporation, whatever it might be. I think it's better to create a nonprofit, or at least create a separate board to manage the Heritage Center or the museum. It gives more focus to the museum, and especially if it's a 501c3, then there's some advantages to fundraising, having a 501c3 and having a board manage that 501c3 and help manage the director of the museum. Usually boards have one employee, and that's the executive director, and then the executive director hires everybody else for the facility. It's not a good idea for a board to manage the employees of the facility. And unfortunately, when you have a tribal council, a lot of times they end up managing everybody, and that's not a good formula for success, at least in my experience. So creating a separate board to manage the facility, whether it's through the tribal government or it's a private nonprofit. Um, and so that's kind of the some of the nuts and bolts of that. But I also wanted to talk about methodology. And I am a huge advocate for Native communities to tell their stories in their own voices. And a lot of museums, and especially tribal museums that got going early on in the 90s, early 2000s, they didn't have the expertise within their own communities to run heritage centers and tribal museums. So they would hire people from the outside to come in, a lot of times non-native people. And the kind of the methodology at the time for developing exhibits was to do everything in the third person. They did this and they did that. Um, I'll use Chugach as an example since Molly's on the call. You know, the Chugach people did this and the Chugach people were here and they did that. And that's just kind of a vanilla way of telling stories. But the true experts in communities are the people within the community, not somebody from someplace else. And so things have evolved over the last 30 years. I remember when I was coming up through the ranks in the late 80s, early 90s, you could count the number of Native American curators across the country on one hand. And now we have hundreds of Native curators working in mainstream museums, working for their own communities. Lots of people now with museum studies degrees when there were very few museum studies programs back in those times. And the methodology has changed quite a bit, where when I was at the Smithsonian, it was a big deal to even have Native people be involved in the development of content for exhibitions and also the management of collections. And Native peoples did not have any say in the management of collections that are associated with their own communities up until probably the early 1990s is when that shifted. And I don't know, the Alaska State Museum may have a longer relationship with the communities there, but across the country, most places did not consult Native constituents for regarding the management and interpretation of collections. And that shifted, the major shift was with the National Museum of the American Indian, where uh, they had a concept called shared authority, where we still had non-native curators kind of leading the process, but inviting people from the community, native communities, to come in and sit down at the table and participate in the development of the content and the management of the collections. Um, and we took that a step further with First Americans Museum. And it's the first major museum of its kind. It's the second largest Native museum in the country. And every word, every piece of media, every script is written or produced by people from the community. So there are 39 tribal nations in Oklahoma. All of the curators we had working on that project were members of those tribes in Oklahoma, and all of the media that we produced was produced by Indigenous peoples from the area. So we, rather than just being invited to the table to participate in the process, we said we're gonna build the table, and we're the ones that are going to be at the table. And Native communities have a great opportunity now to do that. Like I said several years ago, uh, there might not have been the expertise, and I'm using that in quotes, for people. enough people within the community to be able to do that. But I think now um, enough people have gone through different programs and so forth, and there are other tribal museums that can provide technical assistance for the communities to develop these heritage centers and cultural centers themselves, especially the content that goes in there. So I'm a very strong advocate of the first person voice. It's us and we, not them and they. And it's so much more powerful when the community is telling its own stories, and especially with media. And it's we're shifting from just having labels on the wall now to actually having video content of people telling these stories, and um, connect so much better with the audience when you see real people telling stories. So I'm a very strong advocate for that. So anybody considering building a heritage center, a culture center, there's an opportunity now to tell your own stories in your own words and to draw from the elders and the expertise in your own community to tell these stories. Um, Collections management. So along that same train of thought in developing exhibitions, same thing with managing collections. And there's been a huge shift in the last 25 or 30 years in the way collections are managed, and having that I've talked about shared stewardship, but also co-management of collections, um, providing opportunities for the Indigenous communities to come in and work with collection management teams to develop protocols, cultural protocols for the management of those collections. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. And um, so, the one of the biggest things that it's hard for some museum professionals to wrap their minds around, especially people working in collections management, is that, I came up through collections management. So we were taught that you're supposed to preserve everything forever, everything in perpetuity. But that's not the way a lot of Native communities look at their collections. They look at these things as having a life cycle of just like you and me, and that at some point, sometimes these things need to be retired or they're meant to be retired. And that's tough for some people to wrap their minds around, but I think it's important to, in all of this, when I'm talking about all of this, it's not the collections that they're an important part. It's not the display of items that's the important part. It's the relationship that Native communities have with these other institutions. If you're working with other institutions, especially with loans of material or the management of collections, and I think that's very important to understand. And we'll get into some examples here in a second. So planning the facility, and you know, uh, there are not a lot of native architecture firms out there. So usually when a tribal community or native community is planning to build a museum or a heritage center, they're working with an architect that might not be familiar with working with indigenous communities or has limited experience working with indigenous communities. And I like to push the idea that form is very important. I've worked with a lot of architects over the years, and most architects that I've worked with are more interested in having the the image of their design on the cover of architectural magazine and not really thinking about the function of the facility as the number one priority. And I always say it's function before form. And I think you have to understand the use of the facility. What are you going to use the facility for? Are you storing collections? Are you developing exhibitions? But also, are you having community programming in that facility? Are you going to be teaching classes? Are you going to have weddings and funerals in that facility? A lot of times these cultural centers and heritage centers end up being the community center for the whole community, and all kinds of activities will happen. Are you going to Do you need a kitchen to feed people? All of those things you need to take into consideration. A lot of times architects aren't thinking about that. They don't understand that you shouldn't put the kitchen right next door to the collections management facility. So having somebody aboard that understands that, I think, is really important. And that's why I feel honored to be working with Chugach right now, because the architects might not understand kind of the nuances of a facility like that. And then designing the facility, bringing in cultural aesthetics into the design of the facility. It was important to us when we were working on First Americans Museum that the entry faced east, because a lot of the tribes in Oklahoma It was cultural protocol or traditional for the door to face the rising sun to the east. And so we have our entryway to the east. We align things on the cardinal directions. So there may be some um, cultural perspectives, I think, that should go into the design of the facility to make it more culturally relevant. And it differs from each community, and that's what makes it unique, I think. And to think about those things, working with Suquamish, they um, part of their kind of cultural complex, they built a boathouse, and in a particular way where the boathouse was facing the beach, and they could bring in canoes right into the boathouse. The boathouse was built in a very culturally specific way. So I think uh, architects need to listen first before they start sketching things out and finding out what's important to the community in the design. And so that's a great opportunity to get in right from the beginning on that. Um, Interpretive plans. So along with the architectural plan, you start thinking about how the facility is going to be used, who's going to use the facility, start thinking about the exhibitions and the flow of visitors through the facility. A lot of people don't think about, you should have the restrooms next to the meeting places rather than tucked away on another side of the building. If you're going to have programming in the facility, you might want to think about if you in the evening time to make sure it's easy for people to get in the building and have the exhibition space and the collection spaces secure if you're not using those spaces for evening events. All of, entryways coming in and out, how things would flow. Even things like, thinking about school buses dropping kids off, what makes most sense to do that. So all of those things go into not only the architectural plan, but the interpretive plan, the flow of people through the facility, the flow of people through the exhibitions. Um, what does it look like during the daytime? What does it look like in the evening time? Different uses of the facility. And then the operational plan and staffing. Who do you need to run the place? Thinking about security, thinking about custodial, and then of course staff to run the facility, collections management, educational programs, public programming, all of those things, and to have that ready to go and to understand what the effort and the costs are going to be able to do all of those things. And then the build, and it's a little more complicated in Alaska, and depending on where you're at in Alaska for construction. And there's a very short window usually to at least build the shell of the facility, and getting those things planned appropriately and getting that timeline together and all of the elements that go into that. And it's much more expensive to build a heritage center, a cultural center, than it is to build a different kind of facility, because you have to think about climate control, fire suppression, all of those things that add to the cost of building a cultural center. So if you get an architect, oh, we can build this for $600 a square foot, and they haven't built a museum before, then they need a reality check, because it's going to be much more expensive than that to do that. Um, and then if and Molly's going to go through this here pretty soon with Chugach. It may be that if you're receiving collections from other facilities, or you have a facility now, there may have to be temporary storage for things before you move into the final facility. Or if you're remodeling, um, one of my old places where I worked, Gilcrease Museum, actually tore down their museum. They're building a new one. They had to move all the collections out of the facility of the museum and store them temporarily, which cost quite a bit. And logistically, it was very challenging. So think about those kinds of things too as you're getting ready to move into a new facility. Any questions so far on that? Um, okay, I'll go to the next slide. And then opening. So there's a completely different kind of energy when you're developing something and building something, and then on opening day and afterwards. So you've got one goal before you open. You're trying to get to opening, get all the things ready for opening. Um, developing your exhibits, developing, designing and implementing your collections management plan and storage, and public programming, all those things gearing up to the opening. And then which takes a different kind of energy and a different mindset. And then once you're open, then you're open to the public. Then it's more like a conveyor belt. It's a daily grind. You know, you've got to run regular programs. You're getting people in from the public. Um, all of those things that you do on a regular basis that are much different than what you're doing to try to get to opening day. My favorite part is getting to opening day. Um, After opening, to me, it's just it ends up kind of being mundane. Of course, you're going to develop new exhibits and have an exhibition program. You're going to have public programs. You're going to keep things exciting in that way. Um, and a lot of people thrive on that. I like the part of developing the institution and then handing the keys over to somebody else to raise the money and to deal with the staff and deal with the board and deal with all of that. So you have to think about that. It's a different shift in your mindset once you open. And then uh, long-term management. Um, you'll have probably a strategic plan or to get to opening, and then you'll have to shift gears and start thinking about a new strategic plan after you open for down the road. And sometimes it doesn't, you know, are you going to run a endowment campaign to help fund the museum? Uh, all the programs and events you're going to have. Maybe you'll have arts festivals, those kinds of things. Thinking about that. What's your long-term goal in terms of building endowment or of fundraising? Are you going to expand the facility in 5 years? So those kinds of things. And then collections growth. It doesn't matter what size facility you have, you're going to fill it at some point in time. You own a house, you move to a bigger house. It doesn't take too long to fill up that bigger house. You move to an even bigger house, you fill that up. So it doesn't take long. It's great to plan ahead and have additional storage, but it really it seems like it fills up fast. Doesn't matter how big it is, um, fills up quickly. So thinking about growth down the road and maybe even having a long-term plan for that kind of growth. So I wanted to show some examples of some things I've worked on, and I'll get into that. And I want to go back to that methodology. And at First Americans Museum, you know, media is really important now, especially with young people. Throwing a label on the wall now doesn't cut it with Gen Z and others and people younger than that. Um, we wanted to kind of set the tone and tenor at First Americans Museum, and you know, had 39 different tribes, so we couldn't tell just one story. We had to kind of show examples of the diversity of the tribes that we were representing there. But we started the experience by having an immersive program, kind of a theater in the round, to tell origin stories. And we had four distinct origin stories from four different tribes, kind of showing the variety of um, the diversity of our origin stories. And it was a great way to kind of put people in the mood for the experience. So people would come in and be immersed in the storytelling. Of course, storytelling is a tradition among most indigenous peoples on this continent. And it was really a great way to do that. And we had native graphic designers and artists and filmmakers develop these origin stories, and then the narration was by people from the community. And in some cases, we did this bilingually. So I can see communities in Alaska, in particular, having having these great stories to tell, and storytelling is a great tradition, especially in the wintertime. And so I can see this as as an option for communities to kind of set the tone and tenor for the experience. Okay, and it's great for the young people too to hear these stories from the community in a place like this. We also developed a space at First Americans Museum where um, to, kind of a little grove that where we could sit down and actually do storytelling with real people. And I think there could be opportunities in a culture center, heritage center to do that as well. Um, again, I talked about the first person voice and having people tell their own stories in their own words. And so we actually filmed tribal historians and tribal elders um, telling stories. In this case, they're talking about removal from homelands to Oklahoma, which most of the tribes in Oklahoma were removed from someplace else. And we filmed them at human scale. So you'd walk into this kind of small theater and you would sit down, and it was like the person sitting across from you. It wasn't just, a talking head on a screen. It was it was as though you were sitting right across from the person and they were t telling you these stories. It was very, very powerful. And we had four stories of removal in this little theater, and I can see it doesn't, can be any subject really, but it's very powerful to see real human beings almost like they're sitting across from you, telling these stories. And I think it makes a connection to just about any visitor from any walk of life coming in to be able to relate to another human being, and very, very powerful. Um, Now, the way a lot of Native communities tell their history is not the same way that we learn in school. We learn kind of a linear way of telling history, um, where at least in a lot of the communities I work with, it's more of a circular way of telling history. It might not be a straight line, but it's more metaphor in terms of telling history versus, Joe Blow did this on October the 28th, whatever. But we understood our audiences. Yes, the First Americans Museum was for the 39 tribal nations, and we wanted to make those connections with those communities. But we knew the majority of the visitors, 90% of the visitors were not going to be from those tribes. They weren't going to be native. And so we did include kind of a linear timeline in the exhibit that was mirrored with kind of the native way that we would tell time, more in a circular or cyclical way versus this linear way. So they bounced each other out, and this was that um, circular way of telling our histories. And so that was right across um, the hallway there from the pathway there from that linear history. So you got both, and it worked out really well in this particular case. But I think um, Native communities shouldn't be shy about how they want to tell their histories. Understanding who the audiences are, you still have to connect to your audiences. But I think if there are unique ways to tell history in its culturally appropriate way, or culturally, or that relates to the cultural lifeways of the community, I think that's a great way to approach that. And that's the challenge and the fun part of trying to design something, is to make it relevant within the community, but also relevant to other audiences that are coming in. And usually audiences will kind of go in a we're used to doing things kind of clockwise, and a lot of Native communities will do things counterclockwise too. So thinking about the flow of people and what's culturally appropriate in that way. Here's another example of kind of that uh, circular way or cyclical way of telling our histories. And there's a lot of I can go into all the metaphor that's in these exhibits, but that's a full presentation on its own. Um, And then kind of the way we, uh, you know, design the flow of the visitor coming through the exhibits and at First Americans Museum. And then you can see that's the Anchorage Museum in the upper left there on this slide. And that was a great use of, uh, interviewing people within the communities, having media to introduce each of the cultures within the Anchorage Museum. That was very challenging because we were borrowing those collections from the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, and they had parameters on light levels and the fact we were in an earthquake zone. The cases had to be designed a certain way to take up to at least a 6.5, um, for an earthquake, and we did have an earthquake there a while back that was 6.5, and they held up pretty well on 6.5 on the Richter scale, and one of the cases did crack, but for the most part it held up pretty well. um, and then many times communities might not have a lot of material of their own to help tell their stories, and so borrowing from other institutions on long-term loans or that shared stewardship arrangement is a way to kind of help fill out the story. I always feel it's important to not try to build a story around the collections, but figure out what the story is and augment the story with the collections, and that makes it much more powerful. And then also having collections behind the scenes as well. We'll get to that in a second. And what was really special about First Americans Museum is we were able, especially items that were uh, historic from 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we were able to connect descendants of the people that made these things to these items and to help flesh out more of the story behind the items, which was really pretty incredible. We just came out with a film called Reunions that we filmed the reunion of uh, descendants of the people who made these items and with the object. And this gentleman here, Ed Red Eagle Jr., had no idea that this was his great grandfather's jacket. And we were able to, through collections records, find out who the descendants were of the person that made this jacket. And we were able to reunite this person with this jacket. And it was pretty incredible to the stories that came out of that. And we did this probably about a dozen different reunion stories, and it was pretty incredible. So here's another family that was reunited with their great grandfathers. Breechcloth there, you can see these are the great granddaughters of, and there's pictures of the great grandpa and the great grandma there, and they were able to connect with that particular object. And we, Smithsonian has so many rules and regulations, but, the Anchorage Museum and First American Museum, at least the cases are designed to get into them and remove the objects so people, descendants and community members can actually interact with those objects. And so that's something to think about too, as you're developing these exhibitions and access into collection storage. Here are some other items on display. We were able to find the descendants of the people that made these items. And of course, collections, developing a collections storage facility that's culturally appropriate. Many tribes have cultural protocols where maybe only certain members of the community should have access, especially to ceremonial items or shamanic items. And a lot of tribes have cultural protocols about women on moon cycles having interaction with certain objects. There's even a case where men weren't allowed to touch objects here when we worked on the collections management strategy for the National Museum of the American Indian. A couple of the Pueblo tribes have had puberty right items for women that only women could touch and men couldn't touch. And so we try to build that into the collections management guidelines so that the staff working with these collections could be aware of those things. You can imagine that working for the federal government that had rules and laws and statutes that prevented discrimination, they were looking at this as a form of discrimination that you're not allowing men to touch this item, you're not allowing women to touch this item. So that became a real issue, and we were able to at least get the staff to agree that they would voluntarily abide by the wishes of the community. Now, community itself wouldn't have those challenges, or at least in theory they shouldn't, because they can make their own protocols and their own statutes and regulations about how those collections are handled. So consultation is very important. Especially if you've got outside folks coming in to work with the community to help develop the Cultural Center, the Heritage Center. It's important to understand the perspectives of the community and try to work those out. Working with other institutions to borrow collections, understanding the cultural protocols there. And this is an example that this was that puberty rite ceremony for young women. This was a tableta headdress that would go on a young woman's head when she reached puberty. And men weren't even allowed to look at the actual object. We asked the community if it was okay if we covered the object but put an image of the item on the box lid, and they agreed to that. It was okay to look at an image of it, but it wasn't okay to look at the actual item itself. Some tribes, um, this is me many, many, many moons ago, um, as a young dude working at National Museum of the American Indian and working with communities. But we made sure that every object had its own mount or its own its own storage container, and not putting multiple things into. It's different when you have points and archaeological materials that come from a particular site. We had those things in the same containers, but we tried to give everything its own space, its own breathing space, and especially handling things. We didn't have to actually pick up the object itself. We could pick up the container to carry the object or move the object. That was a lot of work to do that. It took a lot of time to be able to do that, but we think of these things as having a living, breathing spirit, and to give those objects its own space. And we even, again, a lot of times these objects, before we took over this collection, a lot of the textiles were folded and would have creases on them. So we wanted to be able to lay things flat if we could. So when communities would come in to look at the objects, they didn't have to unfold things. And of course, it's bad for the object to fold them anyway, but they could see the object without having to handle it, pulling the drawers out. In case of larger textiles, we would roll them on rollers, and they could be unrolled. But try to think of what was best for the object and for the community members coming in to view these items. We had special viewing rooms for sensitive collections, to take them out of the collection, bring them into a viewing room. Now, it could be in your heritage center or cultural center that um, if community members wanted to come in to look at these objects, if they wanted to cleanse themselves or cleanse the object using cedar, sage, whatever it might be, that it's one thing to think about having accommodations in the facility to be able to use those materials without setting off the alarm system. So maybe having a special room that has different kinds of filtration to be able to do that, or a designated space on the grounds of the facility to do it outside. But to think about those things as you're designing the facility and building that into the climate control system, so you could burn cedar inside the facility without setting off the fire suppression system or the alarms in the facility, or to be able to shut that off while you're doing that. So things to consider there as well. Now the cabinets. So we thought of these things as living, breathing entities. These collections were imbued with a living spirit. And a lot of the tribes didn't want their objects stored in plastic bags or even in cabinets that were hermetically sealed, because they believed that we were suffocating the objects. So we actually had special cabinets designed with muslin exteriors on the doors. They were still water resistant, but air could flow into the cabinets and still keep pests and other things out, dust and pests and those kinds of things out. So we actually designed these with these kind of breathable but still water resistant covers on the doors so the objects could be comfortable and not suffocate. Um, Again, this was another community that we had a special viewing room for people to come in, and when you're working with multiple communities, a lot of times communities were uncomfortable with other communities' objects near their community's objects. So we were able to segregate those for the purposes of viewing those items. See, I'm going to look at this real quick. So um, this is an example of Plains Indians where a lot of museums would store the pipe bowl attached to the pipe stem. That's the way they were stored. And that we learned, and in my own community, it's the same way. We learned that it's very inappropriate to store the pipe that way, because once the pipe is connected to the stem, then it's in ceremony. You've started the ceremony, and the ceremony isn't complete until you detach that. And there's a way to initiate this ceremony, and there's a way to end the ceremony. So we had hundreds of these pipes. And so we designed these storage cases or storage containers to store them separately like that, which hadn't been done in 100 years. So, but that's what we learned through consultation with working with the communities, the appropriate way to store these things. Other communities wanted to bring food offerings in to feed the collections. And of course, anybody working in collections know that, putting organic material or food items is going to attract pests and insects. So we work with communities in ways where they could provide the food offerings, but we would monitor that or put them in this case, these little ties that would keep the organic material contained, but still met the purpose that they were there for, to feed the objects. We used the integrated pest management system. In some cases, I think there's a I don't know if I have that slide, but people wanted to sprinkle corn pollen on some objects, and we still allowed that to happen, but we just had to monitor it more often to make sure it wasn't attracting carpet beetles or mice or whatever it might be. In some cases, uh, especially funerary objects, other ceremonial items, we designed our storage cases to be taller than 8 feet, because a lot of the communities we work with believed that there were still living spirits that were moving in and out of these objects or being attracted to these objects, and to keep those spirits kind of give them a little space away from living people. So that those very sensitive items we put on the top, so we wouldn't inadvertently interact with some of these sensitive objects. So it was a little bit more of a challenge. We had to have these lifts to come in to be able to do that, but it was more culturally appropriate that way. And we only learned that by, we actually increased the height of the storage units and the space of the storage units after consulting with the tribes, because a lot of museums will store objects by taxonomical type or order. All the rugs are in one place, all the pots are in another place, and all the baskets are in one place. So you got 120 tribes all lumped together by the type of object it is, and that makes it really challenging for a community to come in and view the objects just for their community. So we actually segregated everything by community or by tribe, and it so that you have objects that are odd sizes and shapes, trying to get them all into the same space. So that actually increased the space that we needed for storage by probably 50%. So it took more money to do that. So that's another thing to think about. If you're building a community center, a heritage center for multiple communities or multiple villages, you might want to store those objects by the village or by the community rather than just lumping things together by item type. And that may increase or may change the configuration of the collection storage space. So something to think about as you're designing, developing the collection storage area. Um, so that's collections. Now you want to get into how much time do we have? We're doing okay? We're at 6 o'clock, supposed to be an hour, but if you want to keep going, I can. If not, I can stop right there and take questions. But I was going to get into the actual public spaces, gift shop, supporting Native artists in the community by having a museum store. It's a way to generate revenue for the museum. Um, oops. Storytelling spaces, public spaces, event spaces. It's a way to have programs throughout the day, evening programs, renting the facility out to generate revenue. This is a storytelling space. It's also a great orientation space for school groups coming in to get them oriented. This is at First Americans Museum, and this is school groups coming in and being able to orient school groups in spaces like that. But anyway, I have other examples. I know I've gone over time, but there's so much to talk about. So I'll stop right there. If people have questions, I might have a few slides I can jump to. I want to be respectful of time.
Yeah, that was amazing. I could listen to this presentation much longer. Are there any questions?
Food service, restaurants, um, theaters, multi-purpose spaces. These are seats that fold back up into the wall, so you can have show movies or have a performance, or you can move them up and have an art market in that space. So renting out the facility for events, weddings, funerals. These spaces become community centers and boardrooms, those kinds of things. So anyway, I can go on and on.
I think that was very cool.
Yeah.
We may have to do a part two, huh?
Yeah.
Maybe.
That was wonderful. I appreciate that a lot. great information.
Mm-hmm.
I could definitely live here for longer.
Yeah, and I have a special place in my heart for Alaska. Three generations of my family lived in Alaska. Um, and I come up every once in a while. But if if you or know anybody that you know would like to sit down and talk about these things, I can talk about your specific uh, uh, circumstance and help come up with a plan as you're developing these things, thinking about these things. And I love to help. It's kind of my mission in life is to help other Native communities take the knowledge that I've gained over the last 40 years and share that knowledge. I remember uh, I put together an advisory group when I was working on First Americans Museum, and Molly's got a nice advisory group for Chugach Museum right now. But we had an advisory group, and we were calling them the Knowledge Keepers. And one of the elders looked at me and she said, "We're not knowledge keepers. We're knowledge givers. The value in knowledge isn't keeping it. The value in knowledge is sharing it." So I thought that was a great way of thinking about things, that they wanted to be called the knowledge givers and they were happy to share their knowledge um, with folks. And so I kind of have that attitude. The value in knowledge isn't keeping it, it's in sharing it. So happy to share my experiences that I've had over the last 40 years working in the field. I know I say 40 at 40 years. I was 3 years old when I started working in the museum field. So anyway,
Well, this was great. And we're actually going to hear from Monica and possibly even Molly and the team next month, I believe. We're going to talk about, where they're at in their project, and they'll answer questions that anyone has about um,
well,
the
yeah, the Chiats, they're right in the middle of that planning phase right now. So those things I talked about earlier, there's more to all of that too. You can get into visitor surveys and all of those things. Depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it. But Chugach is right in the middle of planning and designing right now, and so there's going to be some great information with Molly, and especially working with collections, and then Monica with all the whole development of that project.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. And this was wonderful. Thank you so much.